to Cooper Talk.
Welcome to Cooper Talk. I'm your host, Steve Cooper, and remember, I'm only as hip as my guests. And I got to tell you, people, a few weeks ago, I interviewed John Cafferty from the Beaver Brown Band, and it took me back to the times with Eddie and the Cruisers. And then me growing up in New Jersey, that movie always meant a lot to me. And I had Joey Pants on a few years back, and he talked about it. And I was saying, who else, can I get? And I know I follow this gentleman on Twitter, so I hit him up, and he played Sal Amato, and he was in a show Duet, which I actually watched. I really liked. I think a lot of people liked it. And he was in St. Elmo's Fire and a bunch of other stuff, and he does sports radio now in Lexington. And my guest is Matthew Laurance. How you doing, Matt?
Hi, Steve. Before we start here, okay? Now, I know this is your deal, but I have a question for you, okay? I'm going to flip the switch a minute here. How in the wide world of sports have you been able to do, 940 of these? Are you kidding me?
Okay, I'll tell you. I'll give you the cliff notes.
Okay.
I started doing it as an internet radio show when I lived in Burbank 12 years ago. Started with local comics. My background's in comedy. Started with LA comics. Started getting actors. Probably one guys like Ray Abruzzo and Peter Onorati and all those guys. So I started getting all these actors, and I just kept doing it. I would do 2 a week. And then the studio closed. I was doing it out of my place in LA. Me and my wife moved back to New Jersey. And I've just been doing it, and I love doing it. And so I've been lucky. I get humbled that I can reach out to someone like you who is, playing bass on the stage of Tony Mart's in Eddie and the Cruisers, and I can get you on my show.
Oh, Lord. It's unbelievable. And I looked through the list. I couldn't, 940, I wasn't going to spend all night looking. But so many friends of mine have done this with you. And I'm humbled and honored to be here.
Well, I'm glad you're here because, it's so funny. And I know you have a twin brother. And I was just thinking it was so funny because I always do my research, and I found an old interview with you. It was on TV, and it was this lady, I don't know what it was. You came out, you were juggling apples. And the lady said to you, oh, and you're also in not necessarily the news. And you said, no, that's my brother. And in my head, I'm going, doesn't this lady know to look that up? I've talked to people. Josh Pace was on my show and someone pronounced his name wrong. And I'm like, don't you do your research? I mean, you're in radio. You have to do the research or you come across, first of all, your guest is pissed at you. And they think, oh, I'm talking to some idiot. But I couldn't believe I saw that on a TV show when they have fact checkers and all that, and she basically called you the wrong brother. Yeah.
Oh, well, as you can imagine, it's my identical twin brother, Mitchie, I call him, Mitch Laurance. And, it's a long story about both of us going into acting, but this has happened to us our entire lives. And he's the best friend in the world and has been for me for a long time. But when we first started, I started acting first. And when he decided to do it, we went through a period of about 5 years where we didn't speak because we were competing for jobs with somebody that looked exactly like you. It was horrible. And we finally got to a place where we decided that was ridiculous. And then we started working together, which was great. But this has happened to us our whole lives. I mean, and it's no excuse for that woman. And I can't remember exactly what show it was on that I was being interviewed, but I remember thinking the same thing that you just said.
Well, I got to ask you something about, since you and your brother are both actors, and this just came across to me. Was there ever an audition you both went on and one of you got a call back and the other didn't? And it'd be like, well, did you ever find out why? Was it because of the way you read the part? I mean, were your characteristics the same when you came to acting, or were you independent that way?
Well, clearly, I'm a much better actor than my brother. I mean, clearly, and that's always been the case. He's my older brother, by the way, 4 minutes older. So I've taken crap from him my whole life about that. Actually, we were very afraid of that. And we obviously had different agents. We were both in L.A. I was in New York when he started. He was in L.A. And then I moved out to L.A. In 1981. And it didn't happen. Our agents, if it was going to happen, they scheduled the appointments at different times. And so I was always amazed it didn't happen more than it did. The one time we ran into each other turned out to be for a show that Mitchie got and I didn't. And it turned out to be a huge deal for him. And that was not necessarily the news on HBO, which lasted 6 years. And there we were out in the hallway outside the casting office, both of us. And he went in first, and I went in a couple of actors later, and he got that part. And it was very disturbing that we were both there. But it was great for him. I mean, it launched his career, and he was fantastic with it. Don't tell him I said that, by the way.
Well, now, what made you get into acting? Because it's funny, because you're into sports radio now, and I think a lot of us when we were younger, I loved sports. I loved baseball. I was a big Philadelphia Phillies fan. I knew every stat, every number, but I also loved acting. I loved music. And as I got older, I went through my phases where I'm like, yeah, I want to hear music instead of sports. And that now you've gone to a phase where you're in sports radio. But as a kid, were you into sports or were you into acting, or when did you get the acting bug?
I was actually into both. We grew up mostly on Long Island, and my parents were huge Brooklyn Dodger fans. The first memory I have of life is being at Ebbets Field with my dad. That's how old I am. And always into sports. I started acting. The first play I ever did was in 8th grade. And I did musicals to start out with. The first thing I ever did was Bye Bye Birdie in 8th grade. And I've thought about this a lot, Steve. I think actually it was because I was an identical twin. And we both played sports at that point. And I think I wanted something that I could just call my own. And my brother wasn't doing it. And I just loved, I think I developed this kind of outgoing personality to differentiate myself from my brother. I mean, it's pretty heavy psychological stuff going on here. But I really think that's why acting appealed to me in the way that it did. And I did plays all through high school, musicals. We both went to the same college, and I did theater there. And we got to my senior year. I was going to go to law school, and my brother was going to go to medical school because my father was very poor growing up, and he never wanted to worry about us. So we were going to take that route. And I was taking my law boards my senior year in college, and I put my pencil down and I went, I don't want to do this. What am I doing? And went home, told my dad that I wasn't going to go to law school and that I wanted to be an actor. And it was the only thing I loved doing. My brother and I played 4 sports, but I knew I wasn't going to be a professional athlete. And I ended up when I graduated college, I went to the Neighborhood Playhouse in New York, which was the best acting school there was. And that started my journey of working as a waiter for 6 years and driving a cab in New York City for a year and working with a chimpanzee for 3 months. I bet you remember. Do you remember Zippy the Chimp? Do you know who Zippy the Chimp is?
Yeah, it sounds familiar. Yeah, it sounds familiar.
He was on Ed Sullivan a million times. Okay. Well, the guy that owned him, I did an act with Zippy the Chimp for 3 months. You'll hear, there's a lot of my life that not very many people have done, things that I've done. But that's how I got started. But the sports part has always been a huge part of my life, always.
Now, How do you go from Zippy the Chimp to, I know you one of your first big gigs was SNL.
Yeah.
How did that happen? Because did they say, hey, we need someone to work with Zippy, and Zippy gave you a good resume?
That's pretty funny though. I don't really think I had that on my resume, and I probably should have, because I was with this girl at the time. We were living together, and we got hired as the couple. We did birthday parties, we opened shopping centers, and she was the assistant, the beautiful assistant, and I was in a tuxedo, and it was show business. I should have put that on my resume. I never thought of that. I got very lucky with Saturday Night Live. My brother, Mitchell, was an associate producer on the original Saturday Night Live. He went from being a gopher to an associate director of that show. He did all of the best of video work for 5 years with the original cast. And he originally got that job. A very, very close friend of ours named Alan Zweibel, who was one of the head writers for SNL, wrote all of Gilda Radner's stuff, and is still to this day doing incredible things. And when that 5-year run was, I was up at the office all the time, seeing Mitchell and Alan. And when that cast was leaving, I talked to Alan, who was also going to leave the show, but he got me an audition for the new cast. And that's how I got in there. And I was lucky enough I was a featured player, but I did a lot of things for that whole year in 1981. And it was pretty remarkable. It was an incredible experience.
So what happened? Did they sit there and they just turn to new talent? I mean, because, you see it now, people seem to leave. And I'm at the point where I remember the original SNLs. In fact, I was watching the Christmas and the Bago Glass, and I was just cracking up, and just that stuff reminds me. But what happened with you and SNL? Because did your contract run out, or did you decide to leave, or what happened?
Well, no, it was more an NBC thing. I mean, that year, after the first year of the new cast, Eddie's first year, Eddie Murphy's first year, Joe Piscopo was on that show, Charlie Rocket was on that show, wonderful women were on that show. Also, Denny Dillon and Gail Mathias and Ann Risley. And it was a great group of people, but the show was not very good. And people hated us because we replaced, the best cast ever on Saturday Night Live, the original people. So it was a very difficult year. But for me as an actor, I'm trying to think. The women were actresses. I think, the only actor on the show, although Charlie Rocket did some great stuff later on, but they were all comedians, most of them. So I got all the straight guy parts, kind of like when Bill Murray joined the show. They always gave him, he was the FBI agent or and it was a blast for me just doing it, because who gets to do that? Not very many people. And then it was over after that year. I think Lorne came back after that. Jean Doumanian was the producer the year I was on. She was gone. Dick Ebersol took over again, and they got new cast members, and so it was just that 1 year, but it was fantastic.
So when you're done, where's your head at? Because, you're going from this TV show, you're a young actor, it's like anything. It's not your fault. But as I always say, people who are performers, my background's in stand-up and I've acted, we're a mix of insecure and narcissistic. It's like the weirdest mix ever. It's like it doesn't sound right. But when something like happens, it hurts, even though it's not your fault, I think, because we're sensitive too. So what do you do when you have this, you're on SNL, you're probably expecting it's going to run for a while, and then it just stops. Do you just say, okay, I got to just start auditioning, or where do you focus?
Yes, that's exactly what happened. I kind of knew, I think all of us knew pretty early on that we were not going to be on for 5 years. We pretty much knew And so I did what every other youngish actor in New York did. I started auditioning for things. The big thing for me in my career was I looked very young. I was 31 when I did SNL, but I looked much younger than that. And back then, there was nothing for young actors. There was no, to use a show that I did for 9 years, 90210. There was nothing like that. So I had a lot of trouble getting an agent. I didn't have an agent when I got SNL. And I had trouble getting an agent because there wasn't really anything for me to do. And then I got very lucky. I was doing an off Broadway show in New York. And I got a call from a guy I was in this play with. His wife was a big casting director in LA. And I got to know her. And she called me and said, I can't fly you out here, but if you can get out here, I'm going to set up a meeting with you and Carl Reiner. He's doing a movie. You probably won't want the job, but I think you should come talk to him. And Carl Reiner was my idol. I knew every line from the 2,000-year-old man, Carl Reiner, Mel Brooks. So I got on a plane, I went out, and I sat in front of Carl Reiner. I was speechless. I could barely speak to him. And he was doing a movie called Dead Men Don't Wear Plaid with Steve Martin. And he said to me, you're not going to want to do this, but I'll just throw it out there. I need somebody who's going to work with Steve and me for about 6 weeks, but your face will never be seen on the screen. So I understand if you don't want to do this. I said, how can I work for 6 weeks and not be seen? He said, well, it's a movie where we're using old actors from, Fred McMurray and James Cagney, but all we'll see of you, because you'll be doing scenes with Steve, is the back of your head, your hands, your shoulder, and then we're going to cut to the real old movies. And I said, so wait a minute, you're telling me I can work with you and Steve Martin for 6 weeks? I don't know if I can say this. Can I use
you can say whatever you want. You can say whatever you want.
I said, I don't give a shit if my face is ever seen on the screen. Are you kidding me? And so I went out to LA and had 6 of the best weeks of my life. I sat with Carl Reiner every day for 6 weeks, and Steve also. And it was incredible, and that kind of kept me going. And while I was out in LA, I got a call. By that time, I had somebody who was not really my agent, but working with me. And he said, I have an audition set up for you for this movie, Eddie and the Cruisers. And we know how that all worked out. But I guess we can talk more about that because it means a lot to me that you're from Jersey and that movie meant so much to you.
Well, you know what it is? It's funny because the opening scene, you're at Tony Mart's. And Tony Mart is a place in Summers Point because Ocean City is dry. My older brother was 3 years older. He would get to Tony Mart's. I remember I tried to sneak in one time. I made the crappy fake ID with the college, like my college thing. And the bouncer just laughed at me. And then, he turned his head and me and my friends ran in. And that was the only time I was in Tony Mart. But we knew when it was Eddie and the Cruisers, everyone knew they shot it in the bar. And that was just one of those shows, I told John Caffrey this, On the Dark Side, I still, when I hear that song, it takes me back to when I was in college because I went to college near the Jersey Shore, Stockton State, which is right outside Atlantic City. And, and Eddie and the Cruisers, and I heard just great stories about some of the shooting. Like Joe Pants said, you guys, at the Rickshaw Inn in Cherry Hill, I grew up in Cherry Hill, I know. And it was just one of those things. But so when you got that movie, did you have to learn to play guitar, the bass, or how did that work? Was it an easy audition? What was your process?
This actually is, I think, a really terrific story. Of course I do. I'm in it. Anyway, so I auditioned for Marty Davidson, the director, and Arlene, his sister, who was producing the movie. And in the original script, Sal was the lead guitarist. and Eddie played the bass. And when I went in to meet with them, and it was a pretty big deal. I mean, I remember going to the audition, and Jeff Goldblum was sitting there, and there were some pretty big guys that were, auditioning for this. And I went in, and Marty asked me if I played the guitar. And I told him that I didn't, but I was the best air guitarist that ever lived. Because that's all I used to do, is play the air guitar. And I said, I could stand in front of you and convince you that I'm playing a guitar without a guitar in my hands. And he went, really? And I went out to my car. I had a cassette of Santana. And I brought it into the office, and we put it in, and I played Black Magic Woman on the air guitar in front of Marty. And he loved it. He really could see that musically I could even fake this. They switched it to the bass, and Southside Johnny, as you know, and the Asbury Jukes, Southside worked with us as a band to get us together as a band. And Southside taught me how to play the bass guitar. And I could play every song from that soundtrack on the bass guitar because I had friends who were musicians. And I didn't ever want one of them to watch that movie and go, you weren't playing. I can tell you weren't playing. So I learned how to play the bass for the movie, and it was fantastic. It was great.
What was it like, though? It's a bunch of younger guys. You're shooting, as I said, you're shooting all over the Jersey area. I know I won't say what happened to you guys at the Rickshaw Inn, but Joey Pants told my listeners what happened. And it's funny because we used to drive past there when I was a kid going into Philly. Yeah. And it was across from the racetrack. And we, as kids, because it looked cool, we thought it was like this real nice hotel. But as my mom would say, it was a flea bag place. But you guys were was it because it was low budget, they just put you up there? I mean, what was it like shooting that movie?
For me, now, Tom Berenger, for example, who's in the movie, he had just finished a movie in Rome, Italy. And he came back, and I remember we were all in a car getting ready to drive to Jersey when we started shooting, and we picked Tom up at a hotel in New York. He had just flown in from Rome the day before. For me, this was my second movie. My first movie was 2 scenes shot in a house in Long Island, which also kind of gave me my start in the business too, with Sidney Lumet on a movie called Prince of the City. But to me, I didn't care. I was co-starring in a movie where I was playing the bass, where I was getting paid every week. We were getting per diem because we were on location. I didn't care. I didn't know whether it was a low budget, it was this, it was that. I had never been on a big budget movie. I guess I could put it that way. Shooting the movie was really, really interesting because that John Cafferty were still writing the music when we started. And so we did all the acting stuff first as they were finishing the music. And then we would rehearse at night as a band in downstairs, like at the Rickshaw Inn, and, in this little banquet room, but it was tiny. And we would work on that at night, and then during the day do the acting scenes. And to this day, it's a miracle that the music stuff came out the way that it did. And I think it's really good, all the music stuff. And as you know, it's the biggest cult movie in the world. I'll tell you an interesting story about something that just happened. But the influence of that movie, when the movie came out, it was there and gone in a couple weeks. And what really made that movie was HBO. It was the beginning of cable. And when that movie went on HBO, and I'm sure John must have said this, within a very short time, the album went triple platinum. And it showed the power of HBO and cable and all those things. To this day, it's 40 years ago, Eddie and the Cruisers, 40. I just did, I'm sure you heard about the floods in eastern Kentucky that we just had a couple months ago here. I wanted to do something. I felt kind of helpless, and I wanted to do something to help. And I went to a wonderful gentleman who runs the Kentucky Theater, an iconic movie theater here in Lexington that's been there for 100 years. And I said, I would like to do a special screening of Eddie and the Cruisers, with all the money going to charity for Eastern Kentucky. It was unbelievable. The donations that came in online, we had close to 100 people came on a Saturday night for one screening from a movie that's 40 years old. And it's still, I stood with people before the movie started. Every one of them came up to me and told me stories about why the movie meant so much to them. It chokes me up just thinking about it. And if you have a minute, cut me off if I'm like going too long with this
Keep
stuff.
going. I always tell people, you know what? My thing is that throw the question out. No one listens because of me. They listen because of my guest.
Okay. This says so much about the movie. I have played in celebrity golf tournaments for over 30 years and been very blessed. And one of the tournaments that we played in was in North Carolina in Winston-Salem called the Crosby. And it was the biggest celebrity tournament there was. Jack Nicholson played one year. Michael Jordan used to play. And there were 200, 300 people at the first tee when you would get there. It was a really great 4 or 5 days. Anyway, it was a 3-day tournament. And the first day, I'm walking down the fairway, and they have ropes set up, and people are walking outside the ropes, it's called. And I look over, and I see this guy with a long beard and a camo hat, and he's walking with the crowd. And I just kind of noticed him. The next day, I'm on the golf course, and I look over, and here's this guy walking with my group. And I'm kind of, every hole, I'm kind of looking. The third day, he's still there. So I walked over to him. I'm a sap, by the way. Things choke me up pretty easily. So I walked over to him, and I said, this is crazy, but you can't be following me. I'm not that good. You can't be following me. He said, I am following you. He said, I saw in the paper, I live about 2 hours from here, he said. I saw in the paper that you were playing in the tournament. And I had to come and at some point say hello to you and thank you. I said, what are you talking about? He said, I served during Desert Storm. And I'm from Jersey. He said, and there were a few of us from Jersey. And every single day I was over there, we were over there. We would go, we had a tent, a video tent where people could watch movies. Every single day I was over there, me and the guys from Jersey would go in and watch scenes from Eddie and the Cruisers every day. He said, and you got us through that service over there. And it's things like that. I heard stories at this screening about a month ago that just blew me away. How about this one, Steve? A good friend of mine who I know loved the movie, the first time I met her, she told me, came to the screening, and she had never told me this. She said, I'm going to tell you something now. I've never told you why I love this movie so much. I said, no. She said, my father passed away when he was 41 from a brain tumor about 15 years ago, she said. And when he was getting pretty bad, she said, I had a red convertible, and my dad asked me to take him for a ride in the car just to get out. And he brought a cassette of Eddie and the Cruisers. It was his favorite movie. And we would drive around listening to the soundtrack from the movie. And every day as he got worse, I would take him out and drive him around, and we would listen to that music. I mean, it's still incredible to me. From the Rickshaw Motel 40 years ago to the impact this movie has had on people. It's amazing.
You know, and as I said, I was in college, I believe, when it came out. What year did it come out? It came out in 83. 83. That was my freshman year in college. And it was just, you know, we were going to bars, we were hearing those music. And then even though we didn't have, you know, the ivy walls, the Fatten halls, and the cruisers balls for the thing, we didn't have that, but we were related to it because it related to us. And being from New Jersey, because, you know, I mean, it was just something that you knew the shore, and plus we were close there.
Yeah.
But now, so how did you end up, how come you were the only one that ended up, no, two or three of you ended up in the sequel? What was that about?
Okay, this is an interesting story, too. So I was on, I'm glad you mentioned Duet. That was a series that lasted for 3 years on a new network called the Fox Network.
Which I loved that show. I watched that show. It was good. We're going to talk about that more, but tell me about how you ended up.
It was a great show. Anyway, so I am now on this show, on this series on Fox. And I'm having a great time. This is the first real money that I made. I had a job every day on a series that we knew at least it was going one season. And I get a call from my agent, and he says, I just got a call from the Scotti brothers, who I knew, they're record producers. From the Scotti brothers, they're about to do Eddie and the Cruisers Part 2. And they don't want, Michael Pare was obviously in it, but they don't want anybody else from the original movie except you. And it's shooting in Montreal, and it'll be a week's, probably maybe 3 days, 4 days in Montreal, and then 1 day in Jersey, on the beach in Jersey again. And I said, let me talk to the producers. I spoke to my wonderful producers with Duet. I explained, could I take a week off from the show? And they said, yeah, of course, it'll be good for you, and we'll write something in the script. We'll say you're stuck in traffic somewhere or something. And then I read the script, and I called my agent, and I said, I'm not doing this. I said, this is bad. This is bad. And he said, well, how about this? How about if we ask for a ridiculous amount of money? And if they say, okay, you'll do it. If they say no, you don't lose anything. I said, okay. So he called me the next day, and he said, okay, you're going to Montreal. What? I ended up going to Montreal. I had a great time being with Michael again. Our stuff, I think, is great in that movie. And it should be, because we had the whole first one as history. But I thought the movie was really bad. The songs by John are great, and the band from Part 2. I love those songs too, but it's a shame, because talk about a built-in audience for a movie. People were dying to see Eddie and the Cruisers Part 2, but I don't think the way that it turned out was the best way it could have.
Well, now, in between that time, you also did St. Elmo's Fire, which is, once again, is an 80s movie. It's funny, because when I interviewed John Parr, he had told me that theme was for the Special Olympics. It wasn't for the movie. It was about a guy in a wheelchair. That's why they couldn't get nominated for an Oscar. But once again, you know, college, my age, you know, the same thing. How did that come about? And what was it like working with the Brat Pack? Because you were older than them, and they were probably like, anyone's going to be cocky because they're big stars. But what was that like? I mean, was that an offer, or did you audition for that, or what?
I didn't audition, and I'll tell you why. I was doing when they were casting that movie, and Joel Schumacher was the director of that movie, a fantastic, very big director in Hollywood at the time. I was doing a play in Los Angeles with Leslie Ann Warren, who was incredible. And I was playing, it was a play about two people who worked in the post office, and I was gay. My character was gay. And Joel came and saw me in that play. He was a friend of Leslie Ann's, and he came and he saw me in the play. And a little bit later, when they were casting the part of Ron Dellasandro in St. Elmo's Fire, who is a gay character, Joel, my agent, said, Joel wants to talk to you. So I went in to meet with him. And based on my performance that he had seen in the play, he offered me the part, which was incredible. I mean, and out of that experience with the Brat Pack, I became very friendly with Andrew McCarthy, who to this day remains one of my closest friends, even though we don't see each other very much anymore. And it was quite an experience working with all of them. You know, Demi she was known for being on General Hospital at the time. And Judd and Emilio, I had a great time with them. They were all terrific, all of them. And Andrew and I ended up being friends up till this very day. But that was a really interesting experience as well.
So how did Duet come about? Because as you said, it was the early days of Fox, and it was, and as I said, I don't know, it was a cool show, and you were a cool character, you know, like the writer. But was that a sought after role? I mean, did you know it was going to be one season to start, like you said earlier? You knew that if you signed, it would be a season, or did you just go to pilot?
We didn't really know what was going to happen, because it literally was the opening night of the Fox network we were on. There was a show called Mr. President with George C. Scott, and The Adventures of Beans Baxter was a show. And I went in, I got a call to go in and audition for this part. And I heard other friends of mine talking about this audition that was coming up. And so I just went in, I read for Ruth Bennett and Susan Seeger, who were the two writer-producers of the show. And I hit it off with them immediately, and I ended up going back 3 times, maybe 4 times, as they whittled it down. And then, God, I haven't thought about this in a long time. They cast me first, and then had to find the part that was played by Mary Page Keller, which this was a show about a couple's relationship from the time they meet, the day they meet, and in real time every week going through a relationship. And I remember they were having a lot of trouble finding a Mary for this show. And then she was on a soap opera in New York. They brought her out, and we hit it off, and she is the best. And we just went. I mean, we didn't really know what was going to happen. You sign contracts, of course, but you don't really know what's going to happen. And it was 3 of the best years of my life. It was incredible.
Now, explain, and I've talked to a lot of actors about this, how great it is, as you said, you're going to work every day. And after the first season, you're not sure what's going to happen. And in the middle of the second season, you really get to know the crew. You know, it's becoming like a family. And you know, as you said, you know you're going to get that series regular check, even though it's Fox, not NBC, but you're still getting paid.
It was a good check, believe me.
You're getting that. And then after the second season, it's a popular show. Now, are you getting recognized on the streets now? Are people, I'm sure the cult people knew you from Eddie and the Cruisers and stuff like that, and St. Elmo's. Yeah. But what was that like for you when people started recognizing you? Because one thing, you were a little bit older when it happened, so that's good. You could be more grounded. But what was it like?
It was really interesting. I'll tell you the first time people would recognize me. But it wasn't like I was Brad Pitt or somebody. I mean, different people every once in a while would recognize me. Oh, you're that guy on that show. I love that show. Those kind of things. Here's where it really hit me. I used to try to go to the Comedy Store in Hollywood. And there was always a line to get in there. And I would wait in line to be let in there because there was always, I'm sure you know this, there was always some big shot Hollywood guy doing stand-up in there. And so I would wait to get in. And after Duet had been on a few times, I remember, again, I haven't thought of this in years. I remember going one night and there were maybe 15 people waiting to get in. And I walked to the back of the line. And one of the two guys that were at the door recognized me and walked up to me and said, "Why are you in line here?" I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "You don't have to wait in line here. You're on a series. You don't ever have to wait online here. And that show was great. Come with me." And he took me in and they gave me a seat down in the front. And I remember thinking to myself, boy, times have really changed for me here. I mean, it's a simple thing, but it meant a lot to me. You know, it meant a lot to me. And here's something else. Anything that I've ever done in show business where people recognize me, and we'll talk about 90210, but you talk about getting recognized. I was on that show for 9 years, and it was the most popular show in the world. I got recognized in Europe, all over the place, all the time. But the very first job I did, I said, was with Sidney Lumet on Prince of the City. And I went to that set the first day. I was paralyzed with fear. I had never been on a movie set. And it was with Sidney Lumet, one of the great directors. And Jerry Orbach was there that day, an actor that we idolized. And I went through this thing with Jerry, and I said to Sidney, and I were walking to go to shoot my scene. And I said to Sidney, Jerry Orbach is like the nicest guy in the world. And Sidney Lumet said something to me, and I never forgot it. He said, "Let me tell you something. You're going to have a great career." He said, "Don't ever forget this. The bigger you get, the nicer you are to people. You don't ever have a reason when you're working to be an asshole," he said. "The time for you to not be a good guy is when you're sleeping on somebody's couch and you have no money and you can't get an acting job. When you're working, you be the nicest guy in the world." That's who Jerry Orbach is. And I never forgot that. And I came from a family of my mother and father were that way too. So being recognized, to get all the way back, I know I'm just kind of blabbing here, but being recognized and things like that, I've always been incredibly grateful for that. Incredibly. I've never taken that for granted, ever. Even to this day, I'm on the radio now, and when somebody in Kroger, my grocery store, hears me talk to the cashier and says, "Oh, you're the guy on ESPN radio. I recognize your voice." I'm very grateful that he recognizes my voice because it means he's listening.
That actually, that doesn't happen to me much, but I had interviewed the lead singer from OMD, Orchestral Maneuvers in the Dark, and they had posted the interview on their page. So I get on the guest list to see him in Philly, and I'm walking. Some guy's looking at me, and I'm like, he's like, he recognized me from the picture. He goes, "Oh, that was a great interview," and I was like, "Wow. Oh my God." And then as the show was ending, I went to talk to the lead singer because Jonathan, I had not met him. We had just done what we're doing.
Yeah.
And another guy comes up to me. He goes, "So what'd you think of the show?" I'm like, "That's really good." He's like, "Really good interview." And I was like, "Well, I think because I have glasses and I always wear a hat that some recognizes." But it's one of those things you sit there and you go, you know, you're very humbled. You're like, wow, like, you know, that made a difference. And when it's bigger, like when you're a TV show, so many people recognize you. So okay, so you got recognized from Duet. So what happened with Duet? What happened after the third season? Did they just, I mean, because it was a popular show, it was a good show.
Yeah, I don't really know exactly what happened. I mean, I think we did 57 episodes of that show, which is most people don't get to do 57 episodes of a series. But after the third year, they decided to change it. They turned it into a show called Open House about a real estate office. And they kept Mary and Allison LaPlaca, who was on Duet, also, and they had a comedian was also on that show. Somebody that we know now, her name is Ellen DeGeneres, was also on that show when they changed it to Open House. And so that, you were talking about this before, I was hurt by that. That they decide, and they told me it had nothing to do with me, and they thought our relationship had run its course, Mary and I. It was a show about our relationship. We had gotten married, and then we got divorced, and so they changed it. And I think it ran one more year, and that was it. But that hurt when it first happened, but I pretty quickly got over that also, because I was at a different level after I had been on that show.
So, after you leave the show, you're doing guest roles and in the beginning, and it must be hard going from being the regular to doing guest roles, because especially what you said earlier about always be nice, and I've talked to many actors who say they go on a set and someone's just a real prick, and it might be a guy number 3 on the call sheet that's never had a series, but you get that. What was that like for you, adjusting to being, back you're being a character actor now? You were going from a TV lead to that. Was it hard for you, or were you just glad you were working?
I was just glad I was working. Always. I always felt like that. Because I had so many friends that were incredible actors that couldn't work and wouldn't, they couldn't get a job. So again, that whole thing, anytime I was able to work and make money doing what was my career, I was always happy. And the good thing is, I should say, when I would guest star on the show, I would be the guest star. It wasn't like I was doing 2 lines in a scene. Like when I first started out, maybe I was, an extra and they gave me a line. This was, I always felt like, and I worked with incredible people all along the way. I did an episode of Taxi in 1981 and got to sit and watch for a week Judd Hirsch and Christopher Lloyd and Danny DeVito. And it was like the greatest week in the world. I loved the people that I worked with. I never had a bad experience except, and it wasn't even a real bad experience. It's just an actor that most people love that was not a very nice man. And that was Andy Griffith. Other than that, he was just, he was not a nice man. I'll just leave it at that. I can't think of another time where there wasn't at least one person that I loved meeting, and I become friends with everybody. I'm one of those people. So I always thought, how great that this person's in my life, whatever show I was on.
So you mentioned Beverly Hills 90210. Now that was supposed to be just 1 or 2 episodes. How'd that all come about? That
is exactly right. So I get a call from my agent, and the show had been on it was in the first season, towards the end of the first season. And the first season, it was the lowest rated show on television. A lot of people didn't have Fox at that point. It was 1990, I think, 91. And nobody was watching. It was this bunch of kids in high school, and nobody was watching. I had never seen an episode of the show. And my agent called and said they would like you to come in and talk to them about doing one episode as the father of one of the kids on the show. And I said, I'm not doing that show. That show is supposed to be really bad. And my agent brilliantly said, you've never played a father before. This would be good for you. Just do one episode and it'll be good for you. I said, whose father am I supposed to be? He said, this kid named Brian Austin Green. If you went back 5 years before that, I did a show called Circus of the Stars that used to be on at Thanksgiving every year, and it was a pretty big deal. And there was a 13-year-old kid on the episode I did whose name was Brian Austin Green. He was on Dallas at the time, or I think it was Dallas. Anyway, I spent a few weeks during rehearsals for that show, and I loved that kid. I loved him. I got friendly with his mom. It was great. So I said, okay, I'll go see him. So I went in, I spoke to them. I got hired for one episode of that show. And it turned into 9 years on that show. And that show, of everything, I think it was the least creative thing that I ever did as an actor, because I loved Brian and he was my son. And so I always felt, like this was very natural to me, kind of. But you want to talk about getting recognized. I mean, it's a joke to this day, even. And to be honest, I don't look like I did on that show. The last episode was 1999 of that show.
So would they just keep calling you back? Like, would they say, oh, yeah, we need you? I mean, did you have to keep an open schedule, or how did that work?
No, I didn't keep an open schedule, but they were very accommodating with me. Before they would put me in an episode, and I did, in the 9 years, I think I did close to 40 or 50 episodes, I think. They would always call a couple weeks ahead, and my agent would say, okay, you're booked for these 2 days next week or the week after. And it always worked out, always. I don't know how they did it, but it always worked out. I didn't have a contract that said for this season you'll do 3 episodes or whatever. But as I said, it turned into 9 years of the show.
So after that, you did One Tree Hill, and then you were in a movie in 2009. What made you stop acting? Was it just something you were over it, or you just wanted to change gears? Because I know a lot of people...
I'll tell you what happened. In 1999, I had it. I lived in L.A. for 20 years almost, and I was really sick of it. I was sick of the fact that everything about life was about the business. I got to the point where, if somebody said, how are you doing? And you said, I'm doing great. The first thing they said was, really? What are you working on? Also, the other thing, and this was the real deciding factor for me, was my agent called me one day and said, just so you know what's going on out there, I just submitted you for the lead in a sitcom for NBC. And the casting director, who was probably 25 years old, said, I really like him. I've seen him on 90210, but can he do comedy? It was a sitcom. And my agent said to the casting director, have you looked at his resume? Saturday Night Live, 3 years of his own on a sitcom. He's guest starred on every sitcom there is. And when my agent told me that, I went, I'm getting out of here. I'm not going to be trying to get a job, when I'm 60 or 65, or I've done enough where I shouldn't have to do this. And I had become friendly with Coach K at Duke University over the years. I went to a golf tournament there, and I had dinner with Coach K, and he asked me how I was doing. I said, I want to leave L.A. He said, come work with me. So for 10 years, I did radio for the Duke basketball team, which was incredible. And then playing in another golf tournament, I got offered this job at ESPN radio here, and my wife was from here. We had 2 young boys, and I decided to take the job here. And now you're all caught up.
Now I want to ask you, though, because I was in L.A. for 15, 17 years, and then my wife, she moved out there with me for 3 years, and I came back 5 years ago. And I've talked to people who've left L.A., and I don't know if this happened to you too, but you really, when you move back or you move somewhere else, it takes you like a month to decompress, like not worrying about traffic, not sitting there going, like as you said, what are people going to ask what you're up to? How long did it take you to get used to it? Because you have been acting for so long. That was your life. It happened pretty quickly because I was so excited about being
at Duke. That was the other love of my life, was sports. And I had gotten friendly with Coach K years before that. I loved Duke basketball. I loved him. And there I was, working with that team every day. So I was very excited to be there. And like you say, it was great. I lived a mile and a half from where I worked. There was no traffic instead of getting on the 5 every morning like I had been doing in L.A. It didn't take me that long to decompress, actually, for when I was there. It was great. I was very happy to be out of L.A., very happy.
Now, on your radio show now, what's your focus? Like, I don't listen to Philly sports talk anymore because the fans are. Friend of mine got mad because I said Philly fans are garbage. They're always bitching about something. Jalen Hurts can miss one pass and they go, "Oh, he sucks." And I'm like, "What do you mean?"
Yeah.
And the sportscast, the guys here, they're always playing good cop, bad cop, and just
right.
And they're it's that thing. But what is it like for you being in Lexington? What's your big focus? Basketball?
University of Kentucky basketball.
Now, didn't they boo the coach?
Actually, last night at halftime, there was booing going on. This season has been very bad. And these people, I always say this, the fans, Kentucky basketball fans are not fans. This is like the Taliban here. This is a religious fervor that is unmatched almost anywhere. I know there's Alabama football fans are like this. Big Blue Nation is its own entity, and they are very frustrated and very unhappy with what's going on right now. So, as somebody that has a show every day on the radio, it gives us something to talk about because it's pretty astounding what's going on here with the fans. Yeah.
I have one final question.
Okay.
Do you ever miss the acting? I mean, not the bullshit of the business, but like, would you ever do a play in Kentucky just to get your chops back, or do you miss that?
Yes. It's a great question, and the answer is absolutely. But I'll tell you what I miss more than anything, more even than the work. I miss being on a set. I miss the crew. Those were my guys and women. I loved the crew. I would hang out with them a lot more most of the time than actors. I love that familial feeling on a set and how creative and wonderful people are at their jobs. And that is something that it's really hard to find that when you've had it a lot in your life. And I think that's the thing I miss the most. And at some point, I almost did a play when I moved here, but my boys were very young, and I knew I would be away at rehearsals, and I decided not to. At some point, I will do a play, or who knows? Maybe I'll go visit some friends of mine in L.A., and there'll be somebody as old as I am that's still in the business that'll go, "You want to be a guest star next week?" One of those things. I would love to, but I miss mostly being on the set. That's what I miss.
That's great, man. I want to thank you for taking the time. I know you're on Twitter. What's your Twitter?
My Twitter handle, as the kids say, is @real REAL Lauro LAURO and the number 5. So
people go follow him. I found out today he would not eat squirrel at a Michelin restaurant. I found
exactly that out. Right.
I found that out. But like 40 people on Facebook said they would, which surprised me.
Oh, please. They're lying.
So people, and go, if you haven't seen Eddie and the Cruisers, go watch it. Just go watch it. I know it's hard to find. You can't find it streaming. Go buy it. It's worth it. So people, go check out Matthew. Go to his IMDb. Look at everything he's done. Check it out. Follow me on Twitter @CooperTalk. Go to my website, coopertalk.net. You can find over 940 episodes. Email me, Cooper@coopertalk.net. I'm Steve Cooper. I'm only as hip as my guests. Don't forget, drink your water, eat your vegetables, take your vitamins, and I'll talk to you next time.